These three composers upended tonality, and without them, the 20th century cannot properly be understood. I've done a video about Schoenberg before on this channel, and videos on the other two main members of the group are going to be up in the coming weeks. So instead of me just retreading the same information, this video is going to be more about putting these folks in their proper historical context. So I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about the Second Viennese School. The Second Viennese School is most closely associated with Arnold Schoenberg and his two major pupils, who were also amongst his first, Anton Webern and Alban Berg, but it is by no means limited to them. They were the standard-bearers of the styles and idioms that came to define the school, but broadly speaking, they were the vanguard of the first generation of composers to move away from late Romanticism and into outright atonality. The reason that these three composers in particular are put into the upper echelon has to do with a number of factors. One is their geographical location and its resonance to music history. That is, the first Viennese school is Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, although they were a less coherent artistic movement than was the second. The other is that they were pioneers first in a style of free atonality, which is the negation of all possible pitch centers, and then moving towards use of the 12-tone technique, which was a way to structure atonal music that was invented by Schoenberg and almost immediately thereafter refined by Webern. In the 12-tone system, all 12 chromatic pitches were laid out in an order called a tone row, which could then be flipped backwards and upside down, with the end goal being the use of all pitches equally. Because if you used all pitches equally, then there is no way that you could hear one pitch as being a dominant center. This is designed to result in not just atonality, but a structured atonality. However, they didn't like the term atonality, and instead preferred the term pantonality. And again, this is not the only way to write something atonal, but it was practically the only way to approach atonal composition with anything resembling a formal design and structure, which became very important later on. You often hear the term expressionist as applied to Germanic composers of this era. Expressionism was a movement in the visual arts that explored the deepest and darkest parts of the human psyche, and it's true that composers like Schoenberg tried to explore this also in musical terms and used atonality in order to express that. Or if you're Alban Berg and you want to write an opera about a mentally ill soldier who kills his common-law ex-prostitute wife and then drowns himself trying to clean the knife off, what are you going to do? Something like Rossini? No, you're going to use something that would approach expressionism. But equating expressionism with the Second Viennese School is also way too simplistic. There are overlaps between the expressionistic style and the 12-tone system, but they are by no means synonyms. The German-speaking world between the two wars was a weird place, for sure. Romanticism was dead and buried, and it seemed like every composer was going their own new direction. Everyone from Paul Hindemith, who was using a more practical approach known as Neue Sachlichkeit, or New Objectivity in English, all the way towards composers who felt like they needed to express parts of the human soul and psyche that Romanticism overlooked. In any event, the tonal system was falling apart. Even tonal composers like Jean Sibelius saw this. The question was not, is tonality dying? The question was, what do you do after tonality is finally dead? Leonard Bernstein would attribute this to the increase in ambiguity. Chords meant less and less because the rules of what could go where became progressively blurrier. This marks the true beginning of a composer-audience split that is still wreaking havoc today. By and large, modernist music came to be a pejorative in the vernacular for music that was hard to understand and/or ugly. This is still massively unfortunate for atonal music and the perception it still has in some circles. If you're going by a lack of functional harmony, even much of Debussy is atonal. So atonality does not mean necessarily the Second Viennese School. But it's true that the Second Viennese School pioneered a specific style of atonality, one that prized harsher dissonances and more severe textures. At least to some extent. Schoenberg started his career writing beautiful, late Romantic, lush tonal music. And even when he invented the 12-tone technique, he never always used it in the strictest sense possible. For him, in many cases it was simply a means to an end. He would occasionally be able to bend a rule here and there, but by and large he stuck with his own system because he felt like that was the best way of providing structure to atonality. Berg took this further and made room for tradition and accessibility within a 12-tone framework. He would often move in and out of using the 12-tone system, and whenever he used it, he didn't always use it in the strictest of fashions. Nowhere is this more evident than his beautiful violin concerto, where the tone row is simply a chain of thirds, so even if you heard it, it does sound a little bit tonal. He also doesn't necessarily use this in the strictest sense possible. Often, especially in that piece, he chunks it up into cells, almost like a Bartók approach, like Bartók did in his later string quartets, where he'd have small cells of material and he'd be able to use those much more freely. He wasn't intent on just using the entire row all the way through. In contrast to his fellow pupil Webern, who practically worshipped Schoenberg. He would actually move to follow him around, and almost immediately after Schoenberg invented the system, he refined it, and his entire artistic ethos was built around these small, very dense, pointillistic, crystalline pieces, which are still very hard to get your head around, even if you know what you're in for. So as you can see, these two Schoenberg pupils used Schoenberg's system in two fantastically different ways, almost complete polar opposites, even though they do have one link, which is use of this 12-tone technique. This is why it's so hard to talk about the Second Viennese School as a unified group. There's not a whole lot that always connects them. On one hand, you had Berg not afraid of implying tonal centers as long as they were never uniformly established, whereas Webern was all about pointillism and shortness and succinctness and using all 12 tones and then calling it a day. Webern took the mathematical underpinnings of the 12-tone technique and brought them to a whole new level, and even begun the process of applying these rows and these same techniques in series to various aspects of music that weren't pitch, which were collectively known as serialism. Composers in the following decades would take after Webern more so than the other two, and continue to refine the serial technique into a highly mathematically informed style of music known in and of itself as serialism, and this would dominate musical academia in the decades after Webern's death. While their atonal music never received widespread and broad acclaim from audiences throughout their lifetimes, their effect on their other contemporary composers was nothing short of profound. What they did became a school of thought, to which other composers outside their jurisdiction could latch on to. Such luminaries as Aaron Copland and Igor Stravinsky adopted the 12-tone system and thus entered into the serialist periods of their respective careers. Atonality had long been a thing, regardless of what you wanted to call it, but the Second Viennese School provided the only succinct and tried-and-true method of composition with 12 tones, related only to each other, that provided a structural framework. There was no other way of approaching atonal composition with any degree of structure. This is the reason that Schoenberg invented the system in the first place. He had a hard time structuring his freely atonal compositions, and he found it hard to avoid implying tonal centers in them. It's also, I think, really important to emphasize that even though you're often going to hear the term Second Viennese School applied to these three composers, and these three composers alone, it is just as important to know that their circle extended far beyond just these three insular figures. There were others who latched on to Schoenberg's revolutionary ideas of structure, and so should rightfully be known as members of the Second Viennese School. These included Egon Veles, Viktor Ullmann, and Nikos Skalkatis, who all came from different backgrounds. In the case of Skalkatis, who was Greek, he wanted to use the Greek tradition and Greek music in conjunction with techniques of the Second Viennese School. All the same, these figures and more were not the same pioneers of style that can be attributed to these main three. The Second Viennese School lies at the forefront of what we might refer to as musical modernism, with modernism referring quite broadly to any artistic movement that takes into account its own place in musical history. Schoenberg proudly said that he learned much from Mozart in string quartet writing, and in his early atonal melodrama Pierrot Lunaire, he uses nothing but old forms to provide structure, the structure that he was lacking because at that point he had not invented the 12-tone technique. He also loved the work of Brahms and considered his own technique of developing variation to be an extension of what Brahms did. Webern was a musicologist who loved early music, and his first opus takes the form of a Pasacalia, which is a 17th century Spanish dance. Schoenberg believed, and this is key, that his technique did not break with the past, rather that it continued it. This would lay the ideological framework for much of the rest of the century. This obsession with carrying on a torch of the past became stifling to serialists. Pierre Boulez organized claques to boo Stravinsky pieces that were serial, but weren't serial enough. This would have horrified Schoenberg, who insisted that his students learn his system, but told them that they should not feel pressured to write in it. In fact, he didn't necessarily like when students just copied him. This is attested to by the fact that he also taught John Cage, who was sort of the quintessential anti-serialist. Schoenberg wanted his system to be an atonal analog for the framework of keys that had underpinned the entirety of tonality. And in that case, he definitely succeeded. He believed that it would assure the supremacy of German music for the next century, but all the same, he did not proselytize it.